Imagine you live in the Byzantine Empire as a regular person, say a merchant or a soldier or a cook, or as a regular woman, or even as a slave. How would life have been for you? How would life in the Byzantine Empire have differed from life in the earlier Roman Empire? Would it have been better or worse? Would you still have seen yourself as a Roman? Would you still have gone to the baths like the old Romans? Would you still have worshipped the old gods of your Roman ancestors? Or would you have since long worshipped Christ? Would you still have gone to the games? And if yes, what games? Were there even still gladiatorial games? Or were there only the horse races? And if yes, for how long? Questions over questions. So let us try to find out how it must have been to live in the Byzantine Empire. Before we start with finding out how it must have been to live as a regular person in the Byzantine Empire, it would first be interesting to know what the Byzantine Empire even was and what this term means. This term is an invention of late medieval or early Renaissance European scholars, such as Hieronymus Wolff, who introduced this term at some point in order to denote the later Eastern Roman Empire. But this was a derogatory term, since the Europeans did not like to call the inhabitants of that empire in question Eastern Romans, and their empire Eastern Roman Empire. Why not? Well, because they saw themselves as the true successors of the Roman Empire with their own Holy Roman Empire. And so a term was introduced which would delegitimize the Eastern Romans as not being real successors of the Roman Empire. Even more, the term in itself makes no sense since the city of Byzantium, after which that empire is named, ceased to exist when it was transformed into Constantinople by the Emperor Constantine. However, even though I myself am also not a big fan of the term Byzantine Empire, I do accept its use because it indeed does make sense to use it for the medieval remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire. Because the Eastern Romans underwent a big cultural transformation in the 7th century AD. When I think about the Byzantine Empire, I often imagine a world in which the Byzantine Empire never fell, in which it survived into our modern times. How would such a world look? Imagine you want to create such a world, say for a novel or for an RPG campaign or for a game in general. How would you go about to create a rich and detailed world in which the Byzantine Empire never fell? Well, I would use World Anvil. World Anvil is the ultimate all-in-one software for tabletop gamers, fantasy novelists, and anyone who loves creative world building. World Anvil is not just one tool, it's 3 complete creative tool sets, a world building suite, an RPG campaign manager, and a novel writing and publishing tool. So if you for instance want to write an alternate history novel set in a world in which the Byzantine Empire continued well after 1453 AD, then World Anvil is perfect for you since it is not just a writing software, it's a novel planner and world building application. You can create super detailed family trees to make your characters extremely realistic and believable. You have mind mapping tools to help you keep track of plot lines. You can create detailed and realistic maps and use templates based on proven storytelling methods so that you are sure to be able to finish that novel. And with publishing, subscription and monetization tools, you can even build your fan base. Writer's Digest listed World Anvil as the best website for writers, but World Anvil can also be used for RPG games. 2 million game masters worldwide use World Anvil to create super detailed campaigns. So no matter what kind of world you want to create, there's probably no better world builder suite than World Anvil. You can get 51% off any premium subscription by using the code in the video description. So don't hesitate and start building fascinating worlds with World Anvil. So back to the Byzantine Empire. In the 7th century AD, the largest part of the territories which the Romans had conquered 700 years before was lost to the invading Muslim Caliphate. And with these losses, not only did late antiquity end and the Middle Ages begin, but the culture was utterly transformed, and we can start saying that the Eastern Roman Empire after around 700 AD can already be called the Byzantine Empire, which simply means remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire in the Middle Ages, or the medieval continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. That is all that term means when modern historians use it, since it is nowadays of course not meant anymore as a derogatory term, but its use has been transformed to just denote that smaller medieval Eastern Roman Empire. And for me, it makes absolutely no sense to call the Eastern Roman Empire, for instance in the 4th, 5th, or even in the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire, because in those centuries it still was the Eastern Roman Empire. Now that we have cleared this, let us then take a look at how people lived in that medieval continuation of the earlier Roman Empire. What had changed? Well, as you can guess, a lot had changed. The medieval Eastern Romans, of course, still continue to see themselves as legitimate Romans, as the true successors of the Roman Empire. But of course, they did not have much in common anymore with the Romans of the previous centuries, and even less with the Romans of the earlier Roman Empire or of the Roman Republic. It can be said that after about the 7th century at the latest, the language had firmly become Greek, as Latin started fading into obscurity with the demise of the Western Roman Empire. Latin was replaced with Greek as the administrative and official language of the Eastern Roman Empire in the early 7th century AD. And of course, the Eastern Romans looked quite different from even the late Romans. I already made 2 videos detailing in how far the late Romans wore different clothing than the early Romans, but the Byzantine people of the year 700 and later, of course again wore somewhat different clothing, although many of the late Roman elements were retained. Men wore the following: a chemise, which was a long-sleeved undergarment worn by both sexes, and its purpose was similar to today's undershirt. After the chemise, the garment most prominently worn was the belted tunica, or long chiton. It was modeled after the Roman tunica manicata or talaris, a garment with long sleeves cut in one with the garment or sewn and attached at the shoulders. The tunica fell into a straight line skirt, and the length of the skirt varied from below the knee all the way to the ankle. Another type of tunica, the dalmatica, was also widely worn and has been noted as the most recognizable Byzantine garment. Looser in the sleeve area, it originally was worn over another tunica. Wearing a dalmatica came to represent those who were priests or rulers. In addition, historians believe that underneath the tunic, nearly all Byzantine men wore a hose or stockings. What is not known is whether the stockings were gartered, but what historians do know is that the top of the hose was always to be concealed by the tunica. Women wore the tunic and the chemise slightly different from men. When worn, the chemise would peek out from under the tunica at the wrists, skirt and neck. The silhouette of women's tunics themselves was also slightly different from that of men. Women's tunicas were more form-fitting and thus more often required the use of girdles instead of belts. However, when a belt was worn, Byzantine art shows that the belt was worn at least in 3 different levels: just below the bosom, at the natural waistline, or just below the waistline. Women's necklines too were different. They still wore tunicas with the slit and V-neck styles like men did, but they also had a third type, the scoop neckline. A garment often worn and only worn by women was the stola, the same garment that many women in the previous Roman Empire had worn as well. If we are to judge by religious art and the few depictions of other women outside the court, women generally probably kept their hair covered in public, especially when married. Also, they unfortunately were quite probably more restricted in their movement outside on the streets as compared to men. But the Empress Theodora, the wife of Emperor Justinian, had passed laws protecting the rights of women. For instance, after her reign, women were able to divorce an abusive husband more easily. She also abolished a law that allowed women to be killed for adultery and enacted laws which would prohibit trafficking of young women and even girls. So I would say that women had a much better life in the Byzantine Empire than they had in the West, for example in the Frankish kingdom. Another thing that differed quite drastically from earlier Roman times was of course how religion was practiced. By the year 700, paganism was almost extinguished. There were only a few small holdouts left, such as the remarkable Maniots in some remote parts of the Peloponnese Peninsula. I talked about them in this video here. Therefore, of course, there was normally, especially in the larger cities of the Byzantine Empire, such as Constantinople itself, or Thessalonica, or Athens, of course, no open pagan worship anymore, and probably not even secret pagan worship. The pagan temples had all been closed and had fallen into ruin in many parts, converted into churches, or their building material reused to build new buildings. Hence, as a regular person, you would naturally go to one of the many Greek Orthodox churches, which had been built all across the Byzantine Empire. Another thing that had fundamentally changed in that time was the Roman bathing culture. If you would live in Constantinople of the year 700, this would have possibly been some of the last times you would be able to go bathing like the old Romans had. The last reference to the baths of Zeuxippus being used for bathing was in 713 AD. After that, the baths fell more and more into disuse. The aqueducts had been destroyed in the Persian Avar siege of 626, and after the huge disasters of the Persian War of 602 to 628, and the later losses to the Muslim Caliphate, many of the aqueducts had been in fact destroyed in several cities, and many cities had been affected by a large loss of population, and many of the buildings began to fall into ruin. Constantinople in 700 AD, for instance, only had around 100,000 inhabitants as compared to 500,000 just 150 years earlier. Large parts of the city were deserted, similar to what had happened to Rome after the three sacks of the 5th century. I talked about the surprisingly desolate state of Constantinople in 800 AD in this video here. And so therefore the old custom of Greco-Roman bathing slowly disappeared. That ancient custom only survived in form of baptism pools, but they were purely intended to be used in a religious ritualistic context and thus not meant for spending extended periods of times in them. So how about games then? In old Rome you could go to the Colosseum and witness gladiatorial games or animal hunts. You could go to one of the many circuses of the city, the largest having been the Circus Maximus, and witness incredible chariot races. So could you do that in the Byzantine Empire? Well, gladiatorial games had already been outlawed in the 5th century, quite a few times actually, meaning that probably they still took place in the 400s in secret. However, in the later 400s, they very likely vanished with the fall of the West, and in Constantinople, for instance, there was not even an arena for gladiatorial games anymore. At Constantinople, in the age of Justinian, you of course could still witness incredible chariot races. However, when the empire saw itself confronted with constant warfare from all sides, and when it lost Africa, Egypt and the Levant, so too did the chariot races fall into obscurity. So from 700 AD onwards, chariot races would become far less frequent and would often take on more of a ceremonial role. And yet still, rarely, on special occasions, even in 800 or 900 AD, you could still go to the old hippodrome, which probably would have shown its age by then, and see the blues and greens race against each other as in the old days, however with far less spectacle and rioting. The races continued in that diminished form until the 12th century, when the hippodrome area gradually lost importance and was eventually abandoned. By 1453, when Constantinople fell, the hippodrome had long been an abandoned, half-dilapidated ruin. Hello dear friends of late Roman history, it's me, Sebastian, the creator and the person behind Maiorianus. I apologize for this brief interruption, but I wanted to ask for your help to support Maiorianus and to support the channel so that we can keep Maiorianus a channel about late Roman history. As you know, the YouTube algorithm is often not very kind to niche topics such as late Roman history, and therefore I really need your support in order to keep Maiorianus the way it is, to keep it a channel about late Roman history, so that we can continue to explore this most fascinating era of the late Roman Empire, and so that we won't have to turn Maiorianus into a mainstream history channel. Thanks for considering to support me via Patreon or via a YouTube membership. I cannot thank you people enough. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Majorian himself would be proud. Thank you friends of late Roman history, and back to the video. Due to being viewed as pagan by the church, secular theater plays had fallen out of fashion by 700 AD. But ecclesiastical theater plays might still have existed, but unfortunately that is not 100% proven. So it is not known if you could still go to the theater in 700 AD. And of course, one could go to the many markets of the larger Byzantine cities. Constantinople had many of them, where even after 700 AD, merchants would still sell wares from faraway lands. You would pay still with the old solidus, singular, or solidi, plural, gold coins that had still been continued in the same way since Roman times. And this would remain so until the 11th century, when the solidus would start to be debased severely. One solidus was worth 420 folles, and the smallest units of payment were the nummi, small bronze coins where 16,800 of them would give just one solidus. So how about slaves? In ancient Rome, slavery was very common. How would that have looked in the Byzantine Empire? Well, as with so many other Roman habits, slavery luckily also diminished in the Byzantine Empire. The rights of slaves got progressively bolstered, while the rights of slave owners got progressively restricted. For instance, after Emperor Justinian, killing a slave was seen as murder, and a slave had a lot more rights to defend himself against injustice. After the first half of the 7th century, slaves were already a rare sight. However, it should be noted that even though it was rightfully finally frowned upon by society due to the rising influence of Christianity, slavery still remained legal even after the 700s. For instance, Basil I was said to have received 3,000 slaves as a gift in the 9th century, and the eunuch of Basil II was also said to have owned a few thousand slaves. Slaves were still sold in Constantinople, and for instance, during the reconquest of Crete, it is said that 200,000 women and children were taken as slaves back to Constantinople. But such things became more and more rare, and by the 12th century, slaves had slowly transformed into serfs tied to certain land estates, basically what would become the feudal system. Food also changed with regards to earlier Roman times. When Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, fell, naturally, of course, the missing grain imports meant that less grain-based foods were eaten, so therefore more meat and fish-based foods became the norm. However, of course, bread in all its varieties was of course still consumed. Of course, the famous fermented fish sauce, which the Romans liked, called garum, was still very popular, well into the late Byzantine period. Salted pork was also very popular, as was chicken, but beef was not so common because cattle was most often used for working the fields. So we find a rich variety of food, which I will of course explore in an own video. And of course, a rich variety of different wines was consumed. In fact, Byzantine wines were quite the rage in Western Europe. But how about housing itself? How did the people of the Byzantine Empire live? Well, the well-off had large multi-roomed houses with inner courtyards, bathrooms, gardens, fountains, and even a small chapel. The public rooms of such houses had marble floors and walls decorated with mosaics, while the private rooms, such as bedrooms, which were usually on the second floor, had painted interiors. But the poorer citizens in the larger cities, especially in Constantinople, lived in insula type of apartment buildings made of brick and mortar, quite similar to the insulae in Old Rome, and they too had many stories. Of course, there was no running water, so sanitation was quite rudimentary, again similar to Old Rome. In rural areas, a small group of houses might be built to form a village. Buildings here had two stories, the lower for animals and the upper for the farmers, and an inner courtyard overlooked by a veranda. Rural houses had no running water, and there is no evidence of interior bathrooms. So we can see that while in some regards life in the Byzantine Empire was very different from earlier Roman times, in other regards it was still quite similar to earlier Roman times, and hence we could still find many Roman aspects in the so-called Byzantines even after 700 AD. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And I would of course like to thank everyone who is supporting Maiorianus in any form, be it through Patreon, YouTube membership, or through a PayPal donation. Thank you for supporting Maiorianus so that I can keep this a channel about late Roman history. And if you want to learn more about the state of Constantinople in 800 AD, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about why I am not such a big fan of the term Byzantine Empire, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.